to Daniel. So I wanted to give you the names. Now, the book of Daniel is written partially in Hebrew and partially in Aramaic. So Daniel in Hebrew means God is my judge, and there is no Aramaic version of Daniel. It means God is my judge. So that was the only one that it had a second one. The next one was Hananiah. Hananiah's name means God is gracious in Hebrew. And Mishael means who is like God, or what is God like in Hebrew. And Azariah means Jehovah has helped in Hebrew. Then the names were changed, and the reason the names were changed was to force them to forget everything that they learned, their Jewishness or their Hebrewness. They wanted them to forget it. They wanted to assimilate them into the current culture, which was the Babylonian culture. So Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar, which means protect the king in Hebrew and in Aramaic. So I thought it's very interesting. Now, the word Bel, as in Belteshazzar, means that was the god who was supposed to protect, was the god Marduk, and that was the national god of the Babylonians. So the Babylonians had a bunch of gods. They had gods for everything, but then it was the chief god. He was in charge of all the other gods, and Daniel name was synonymous with that. So it's very interesting that the head guy, and we'll see as we go through, that Daniel earned a lot of firsts, and some of those firsts kind of got him into trouble. Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach, which means command of the moon god in Hebrew, but it means royal or the great scribe in Aramaic. So his name in Hebrew actually told of what he was supposed to be, command of the moon god, but they were trying to bestow a little bit of honor on him by being royal or a great scribe in Aramaic. Mishael was changed to Meshach, which means who is Aku in Hebrew. In Aramaic, it means guest of the king. And I don't know what the Aku meant. I looked 3 different things up about it. I thought maybe it was a god or something, but I came up pretty much blank, so we'll just leave it at that. And then Azariah was changed to Abednego, which means servant or slave of the god Nebo in Hebrew. Nebo, or Nego, is most likely the god of the planet Mercury, and they worship the planet Mercury. So you can see that Azariah, or Abednego, was a little lower, because he had a planet, the other one had a moon.
How did they know what the planet Mercury was back
Oh,
then?
they knew a lot. They were smart.
They actually had a name?
Oh, yeah.
Mercury back then?
Yeah, well, they had a god for it, too. And in Aramaic, his name was a work of light. So, very interesting.
They changed their names, but they really didn't matter.
No,
Not to them.
they didn't. And we're going to see. We're going to look at the story today of the king's dream. We may not get through it because it's about it's pretty long. And we'll start on it, and then we'll go until we're done. But Daniel, not only was he, what's the right word to use? Daniel wasn't always just right with God and purposed in his heart that he was not going to defile himself with anything from the palace. Anything. It didn't matter what it was. And that was, by the way, the heated conversation, I wouldn't say heated, but lively conversation I had with my daughter and my daughter's friend, Christian, that I told you about last week, revolved around, well, he was tempted by the meat. First of all, I don't think he was tempted at all by it. And the second thing, it wasn't just the meat. And that's what I try to tell people, that as you read through the book of Daniel, the things that he was supposed to be introduced into that culture and completely changed from his Hebrewness into a true Babylonian, because he was going to probably be one of, if they had their way, he would have been number 2 to the king. And you'll see that as we go through the book. So he needed to know everything. Now, he was okay with the learning. I'll learn everything you guys want me to learn, but I'm not going to partake of your nonsense. And not only, this is the part I like about it, not only am I not going to partake of your nonsense, but I'm not afraid to stand up and tell you that I'm not going to partake of your nonsense. And we're going to see that in one of the other chapters. I only listed it by story, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, but in one of them, the one where he gets thrown into the lion's den, right? So what did they do? They made a decree because they were after him, right? Just like going on today in the world. And they were after him, and he said, all right, make the decree. By the way, he was higher than all of that. And the decree wasn't supposed to go before the king until it went before Daniel, because he was the number 2 guy. Anyway, they went around him, just like the deep state goes around, right? The sneakiness, nothing's changed under the sun. Solomon was so right when he said nothing's changed under the sun. Well, anyway, the decree went out, and what does it say? It didn't say a couple of days later. It said Daniel immediately went home. And what did he do? He opened up his window, and he prayed to his God in public. He could have kept the window closed. He could have went to the corner of his room, but he didn't. He was kind of swatted the hornet's nest, but he didn't run. A lot of people will swat the hornet's nest and then run, and as the whole world's erupting in chaos, Daniel's like, I don't care. I serve my God. And he had a great thing to say. I think we'll see that in the first or the second story here about Nebuchadnezzar, that he says, you want to throw me in the furnace? God will either protect me or I'll go home to be with God. Where's the downside? There's no downside to what you're going to do. It was almost like he didn't care. Now, he did care. He cared about, I'm going to stay right with my God, right up to the end. And we never heard one thing in the book of Daniel that anything he did wrong. Ever. And that's a change from any of the other people that we read about. A lot of times people will give God lip. Now, maybe Daniel had his faults, and I'm sure he did, but we're not told what they were. We're told that he was an upright man who stood before the Lord pretty much blameless, and God showed him things that he didn't show anybody else, which I thought was really good. So let's start off in Daniel 2, and we're gonna read verses 1 through 5. And in Daniel 2, verses 1 through 5, it says that in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Sirach, O king, live forever. Tell thy servant the dream, and we will show the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If he will make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall, or if you will not make known to me the dream, the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut into pieces, and your house shall be made a dunghill. So, here's what he said. Wow, I just had this bad dream. What was it? I don't remember. But it was awful. I better call in the magicians. So the sorcerers and all of the astrologers and all of that people. By the way, that's why they knew about all this moon and sun and planets. They had astrologers. And they came in and he said, I had a dream. You need to tell me what it means. You will tell us the dream. I don't remember the dream. You tell me. You're so special. So now these guys are like, wait a minute.
I'm dead. I'm a dead man.
They're like,
My house is a dump. Yeah, house is a dump.
and he's like, so he makes a deal, but it's not a good deal for the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans. So I just thought that it's really funny that this, by the way, shows God's sense of humor, right? It's kind of funny that God allowed him to have a dream. Obviously, the dream was from God. And then he allowed him to forget the dream, and just to show, when Moses, it was Moses, when he did the things, the magicians of the day were able to do certain things. Now, I cast my cane down, my stick, my rod, and then it turns into a snake. Oh yeah, we can do that too. They threw their rod down and it turned into a snake, and then Moses' snake ate their snakes. And it's like, well, see, at least we did that. And the one thing was, back in the day, they could do things, but they really couldn't undo them. So when God caused all those things to happen while they were in Egypt, and with the flies, the lice, the frogs, turning the water to blood, they're like, yeah, we can turn water to blood too. Oh, there, the water's blood. Well, now what are we going to drink? Oh, can you turn it back? Now we can't do that. And you know what it reminds me of today? Hate to get political. No, I don't. It reminds me today of global warming. You notice that we can break anything, but we can never fix anything? But it's the same thing as the Bible. These magicians, they can break anything. They could duplicate some of these miracles that God did, but then they couldn't undo it. They couldn't undo it, and they were stuck with what they created from their magic.
So they were all of the devil, right?
They were all of the devil, yep.
And the devil.
And there just was no undoing it. And it's just like today. Now, I don't believe that man has anything to do with the changing conditions on the planet, because the sun that is out there is much bigger than all of us. Now, I'm not talking about God's sun, I'm talking about the sun that changes the planet. So, but I digress. So let's read on. He says to them, he makes them a deal, but if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. So this is Daniel 2, starting in verse 6. And we'll go up to 13. And they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation. So what did he say to him right there? He goes, you know what? You're just looking for some time to make up some lies about my dream. But if you can tell me what the dream was, and then tell me, I'll believe the interpretation. But if you can't tell me what the dream was, well, then I'm going to have to turn you guys into a dumbbell. And so in verse 10, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such a thing at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh, and that's gods with a small g. For this cause the king was angry and furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And a decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellow servants to be slain. So the first story is that they ticked off the king, and that was really bad. So kind of reminds me of people who talk too much. They could have said, okay, give us some time, we'll come back and we'll give you the interpretation of the dream. And then they kind of hightailed it out of there. But instead, they start arguing with the king and say, well, how are we supposed to do that? And he's like, what are you guys, all a bunch of phonies? Well, I want you all killed. So in verse 13, he put out a decree that they should all be put to death. So, very interesting. So they got to Daniel and his friends, and then Daniel answered, and this is now Daniel 2, 14 through 19. But Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arash, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arash, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arash made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. Hey, just what I said. Give me some time, and I'll show you the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house, and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire the mercies of God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellow should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So not only did he go to bat for him and his friends, but he also went to bat for all the wise men who might not have been that wise at this point. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. And then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So what happens here? Daniel goes back, he goes to the king. He's like, first of all, and I can just picture, Daniel's doing his thing, he's reading, studying, learning, and all of a sudden there's the decree comes out. And by the way, Daniel was favored. He was liked by everybody, and it always says that the people in high places, they always liked him. That's one of the reasons he got brought into the king's palace. So he came out and he says, what's all the hubbub? And they're like, well, he told everybody he's got to be put to death. And he goes, what guy? Who spit in his cornflakes? And he's like, well, all the magicians and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans couldn't answer this dream. And he went, oh, well, you know what? Let me pray to God and see if he gives me an answer. And so the captain went back and said, all right, let's give him a shot at it. Now, this dream really troubled him a lot. And you ever wake up from a dream like that? That's like really, really, really freaky. We've all probably had bad dreams, but this one, he couldn't let go. So he took a look at it, and he said, let me pray. And he went to God. And again, you have this attitude of, either God's going to give me the interpretation, in which case I'll be able to tell what the dream is, or he's not, and we're all going to die anyway, and we're going to be with God. So where's the downside to this? In one sense, Daniel had nothing to lose in any of these things. But we're going to see a funny one in chapter 5, which you'll have to wait a couple of weeks until we get to chapter 5, because they offered him something. He's like, he was like, I'm not really that interested. So what happens? Well, in Daniel 2, in 24 through 28, it says, therefore Daniel went in unto Arok, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Now you'd think that everybody would have really liked him for that. And they probably did. But man, they were going to kill us all. But Daniel stepped in. And I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arok brought in Daniel before the king in haste. And believe me, they wanted this thing over. This was big. And said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded, cannot the wise men and the astrologers and the magicians and soothsayers show unto the king? But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and thy vision of thy head upon thy bed are these. So God gave him the interpretation, and Daniel then goes in, and he starts to tell him what it was. So it's very interesting to see the things that Daniel was actually able to do by being a just and upright man. Now, we do have the story of Jonah, who was not a just and upright man, who God was able to tell certain things to as well. And but you see the difference in the type of things that they were given. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is one of the great kings of all time, because Babylon in that day was the greatest kingdom that existed, and it was a one world government. Everywhere that mankind was, roughly speaking, Nebuchadnezzar ruled. So he was the biggest, the most powerful, and by the way, that's what this dream had to do with. The dream had to do with the fact that he was one of the greatest, because there were lesser kings that came about afterwards. And as we go through the book of Daniel, you're going to see a progression until we get to the point in time where there is no more one world government. Now there will be again in the end times, but this one world ruler that was started by Nebuchadnezzar with the nation of Babylon was kind of new, because it's the first time when they're showing you that if you were anybody, you got taken over by Nebuchadnezzar, and everybody in the world was a Babylonian. What's that?
He was a good king.
He had his shortcomings, but he listened to God. As we'll see when we read the story, we're almost out of time, and the story of what it stood for and all of the interpretation and history is long, so we'll save it for next week. But what I wanted to get through is that the point that when you see how Daniel interacted with people and with everybody, that there are times when God rewards people for what they do. And Daniel didn't have to be as committed. I think I mentioned this last Thursday. You know, when a decree goes out, you could have stayed in the corner of your room, and you could have, done what, you're doing for God in secret. You don't have to go out there on the street corner. Would I do what he did? Heck no. I wouldn't be standing up there. Now, we live in a different time where I don't know, how often we see miracles. I'm not saying that God doesn't perform them, but we don't always see miracles. And we don't also know today if a miracle that we see is from God or from Satan. And that's one of the problems that we have, and that's one of the dangers we have of trying to say things like, let's take Donald Trump's attempted assassination. He said, let's look at that sign. And then all of a sudden, boom, if his head was this way, we went in, boom, he would have been dead. But he turned his head, and that shot was about 1 second or less from the time he turned his head. Okay? That's how quick that happened. Was that a miracle from God? Or is that Satan working in the world? We may never know until we get to heaven. Now, we obviously know that it wasn't time for him to go home and meet his maker, President Trump. But we don't know. We don't know what kind of things and miracles that God does today. One of the sermons that I'm working on, and I don't know if I'll do it on a Thursday or a Sunday, is going to be from the book of Genesis. And there are some things in that book that are highly controversial about the sons of God. And that's all I'll say about it. So those people listening online have to tune back in so they can find out when I'm going to talk about that. But when we look at the things and the way that God works, it's different today than it was back then. God spoke to people back then. We know that God doesn't speak audibly. So when someone says, God told me that I am to, God didn't tell you anything, because the only way God speaks is through his word. So if you say, well, I shouldn't have stole that, and then you're convicted, and all of these verses come to your mind about how stealing is bad, that's God speaking to you. And that's the only way he does it. He doesn't come down with a voice out of heaven going, Joanna. He doesn't do that. So you don't have. So if you hear a voice out of heaven saying Joanna, it's probably going to be me. It won't be out of heaven; it'll be outside your front door. So I want you to remember one thing: that when you are obedient to God in things that we're obedient because we live our lives the way we're supposed to. God says, don't do this, do this, and we do that for the most part. But if you go the extra mile for God, I think God has a tendency to reward his people for going the extra mile. And he rewarded Daniel here. Because as we go through this book, you're going to see the things that he got. And most of them were good. But everybody liked him. He was elevated to the top. But just like you get, it's lonely at the top, people started coming after him because of jealousy. But he handled that one right too. Just didn't care.
Yeah, they didn't stop either.
Yep. And the big thing is that he knew what he was supposed to know, and therefore he acted upon it, and he made a commitment to God at a very young age. By the way, a lot of the commentaries that I read this past week all said he was about 14 when he was taken captive. So I was pretty right about that, thinking that he had to be an early teenager when he was taken captive. And once he was, he must have had some really rock solid upbringing to be 14 years old and thrust into a situation where every pleasure of the world, regardless of what it was, whether it was clothing, whether it was food, whether it was sexual thing, it didn't matter what it was there for him, and it was there for him for the taking. Because when you're in the king's palace, you get anything you want. It wasn't like he was just brought in to look around. You can look, but you can't touch. No, this is all here for you as part of indoctrination into the Babylonian culture. So Daniel was very good at saying, you know what, I'm not a Babylonian, I'm a Hebrew. And I serve a true God, and God got to use him in this very, very special way. So a miracle would be that God allowed him to live, right? His parents were most likely killed. Most of his other friends were most likely killed. He just had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that were told. Now, I'm sure there were other people taken out of there as well as them. And I picture when they're in the king's palace, they're in their classroom, learning class, and there was probably a big long table with 50 seats on either side, and it was all of the ones that were taken captive. But some of them probably had good attitudes, and some of them probably had bad attitudes. And there were some that probably flunked out. We had high hopes for you, boy, and didn't work out, and I don't know what happened to them. But the Babylonians weren't the nicest people in the world. But when you're in the king's palace, you got what you want. So, and Daniel was not going to defile himself with any of it. So, any questions?
No.
I hope you'll learn. So that took me halfway through my notes. But it took me 2.5 weeks. Yeah, there's a lot more.